Let's have a look at how we create Sanguinius' face. I begin by adding a layer of Cadian flesh tone across the entirety of Sanguinius' head. We'll add one layer. It won't be a very consistent finish, but there's no need to worry about that. The black and white undercoat should give us the balance we're looking for as we further develop those tones. Now, a bit about the overall theory of Sanguinius. There's a lot of yellow on this miniature, from the non-metallic metal, the real metallic metal, and his bleached blonde hair. A second layer of Cadian flesh tone and Elendil violet is added. Why the violet? Well, there's a lot of yellow involved. By adding violet, a complementary colour on the colour wheel, we are drawing attention to the face. The face will stand out more by adding more purple tones, purple hues to the lower third of the face and around the cheek. While the paint is still drying, I'm adding Rhinoxide by Games Workshop. This is for the shadow. Unlike other pieces I've shown you in the past, I do not want a blue inflection. I do not want Sanguinius to look like he has a 5 o'clock shadow. Call me biased, but I think that Sanguinius, he's in the mould of an angel, and that he's always looked clean shaven. He'd always appear how he wanted to appear. In this instance, a pretty boy. While the paint's still drying, I'll manipulate it with a brush to ensure that the blend is nice and smooth in between the transitions from the mid-tone around the cheek through to the shadow. Okay, next I'm using Sunny Skin Tone by Vallejo, and I am sketching in the top shadows. Pay attention to the movement of my brush as I sweep it across the highlight. I'm not too concerned about the blending at this stage. It's all very rough. It's a rough establishment of the shadows and highlights. It doesn't look great, right? I mean, look at it. It looks atrocious. If we left the miniature looking like that, yeah, it would be pretty disastrous. Before the paint is fully dried, I have mixed some ice yellow into some Sunny Skin Tone, about 90 to 10% in favour of ice yellow, and I'm just sketching the highlight again on top of that, creating a very, very bad looking Sanguinius miniature. Now once that's dried, once I've added a few correcting marks just underneath the eyes, because I have a camera in between me and the subject, I just need to make sure there are no slips. After those corrections, I make a mixture of Rhinoxide plus Elendil violet, and this is the glaze layer, this is the filter layer, and the filter layer is placed across the entirety of the face, and it should modulate the underlying colours. It tints the underlying colours, and it also has a really nice side effect of blending the tones together. So any weird disparate tones that you have, you can blend seamlessly together. Now you need very little paint on the brush itself for this procedure, and we need to wipe it across the surface. Before it dries completely, I've just got some Cadian flesh tone on the very tip of my brush, and I am blending between the mid-tone and the shadow. In fact, I'm putting it over everywhere that needs a blend. Any weird odd transitions we've made with the first marks of the brush, we're blending together now. That filter layer, by the way, was just created by using Elendil violet, Rhinoxide and water. So it'll be about 80% water, 10% Elendil, 10% Rhinoxide. When that's placed over the miniature, we have to ensure that nothing pools in any areas. English uniform is used for the hair. You're seeing me paint this in the stages I would normally. Instead of cutting up the video to show the entirety of the face, I wouldn't wait for the face to completely dry before moving forward, because I have the colours already on my palette. I've decided to block in the hair while I wait for the skin to dry. Before the paint dries completely, I'm adding ice yellow and I'm mixing it into the hair as the paint is drying. I'm drawing the brush from the base, from where the hair meets the head, and I'm drawing it towards the tips of the hair. I want the highlight to exist at the top. That way I get maximum contrast between the violet in the skin tone and the yellow of his hair. Now before we do any more correcting marks, before we paint any more of the miniature, we need to glue the head in. If we painted the head in total isolation, we will end up with some very odd reflection marks of the skin. So we need to paint in the inner gorget, which I've done by adding a layer of Thamar black and then Thunderhawk blue to highlight it, just as a very rough initial highlight. And I'll also block in the Carnodon. That's the name of the lion on his shoulder pauldron. Ice yellow is used again to block in the hair. This time it's a layering technique, so the paint is being painted onto a dry surface. There's no wet blend whatsoever, and I'm blocking in the top highlights. Again, it's quite blocky, quite harsh transitions in tone, preparing it for this wash layer, this filter layer of English uniform and a touch of Sol yellow. And this is glazed across the entirety of the head. I will then thicken up the mixture and add a highlight by just drawing it across the surface. Okay, now the top highlights for the face. Cadian flesh tone plus sunny skin tone. I've moved down the brush size. As you can see, I've moved down to a 1 for the Winsor Newton instead of painting everything with a 2. Oh no, sorry, this is a 0 brush. My mistake. That's a 0 brush we can see in front of us with the Winsor & Newton, and I was painting the face with a number 2 brush up until this point. Ice yellow and Vallejo model colour is used to highlight the face, drawing it towards the top of his cheek. There will be, so you can see the notebook where these reflections will sit. I'm always trying to draw the paint, the bristles of the brush towards the highlight, where I want the maximum amount of pigment to sit. There's slightly more Cadian flesh tone in the mixture at this point because I am not drawing it towards the highlight. It's the reflection, bounce reflection of his jaw that picks up on ambient surroundings. I've added a touch more sunny skin tone into this mixture because it's the top of his cheek and it will reflect more light hitting it. I'm just gently fanning the paint to where I want it to sit. Now the consistency of the paint is around 70% paint, 30% water. I personally don't use thinners or glazed mediums, but absolutely if you feel like it aids you, I know in hotter countries you do have problems with paint thinning out and drying out before you get the chance to do this. By all means add acrylic thinner to the mixture, anything that helps you. I've added a touch of ice yellow into the previous mixture and I'm just drawing the blade, the tip of the brush. Don't use a blade at this part, it will knack your miniature. I'm using the tip of the brush just to add those very top highlights. Again, same consistency, it's almost a glaze at this point, just tying everything together. I've used deep red and the previous skin tone colour we have so far to add colour to his lips. And then I'm using Rhinox hide to paint in his eyes and the eyebrows. So at this stage you should start to see the miniature emerging. We have blocked in the major sources of light and shadow and the major hues. From here on out it's about refinement. Deep red by scale 75 on the lips and just underneath the eyes. Okay, next up, Sol yellow and ice yellow. This is the very tippy top highlight that we have going on. We have talked about previously, especially in the Mongol tutorial and the PDF tutorial, how we can break up the zones of the face. Towards the top of the head and top of the cheeks there is more yellow, in the hue. Towards the middle section we'll have more rosier tones of magenta and red, and towards the base we'll have cooler tones, greens, purples, blues. In this instance we haven't got much in the way of blues, but we do certainly have well, the way we've transferred the colour onto the cheeks, we've drawn it down, so there is a touch of violet towards the base, a cool colour, and some notes of red towards the top of his cheeks. Then yellow for the top of his head to sell the effect. Finally, for the hair we use ice yellow as a layering technique. This is not as thick as our previous mixture. This is around a glaze consistency of 60 to 70% paint to 40 to 30% water, or glaze medium or thinner, whatever you find is easiest to use on your miniatures to get to make the paint slip off the brush. And this is added as a highlight. Now this is why it's so important to apply the head, or to glue the head on, before we make these final highlights. If we highlighted this head in isolation, if it was just pinned on a piece of cork, well, the reflections will be off and they will not look natural when placed on the miniature. I've done it before in the past and it's taken me a long time to figure out why it looks so odd. That's the reason why. You're adding final reflections in isolation to the rest of the miniature. We need a nice cohesive image in front of us that we are able to create a universal highlighting pattern for. Next up, let's do the laurel wreath on Sanguinius's brow. I begin the painting process by adding boreal tree green, and before the paint is completely settled, added thamar black in the interrupting strips between it, so into the shadows. I'm adding a touch of shadow as the paint dries. It just allows the paint for me to speed up the painting process, instead of adding a layer, waiting for it to dry, and then another layer, and building it up. I can mix very easily in between these tones and build up a transition very quickly. Next up, I'm using boreal tree green and ice yellow, about 50-50, so it is quite a bright colour at this stage. And this is a highlight onto the laurel wreath. Boreal Tree Green is then used as a glaze, so around 50% water to paint, and this is applied very gently, very little paint on the actual brush itself, over the top highlights to blend that ice yellow back into the surroundings. Now as the paint dries, I can add a very minute amount of ice yellow to the tip of my brush, add it to the top highlight, then as I sweep my brush down, it creates a glaze, it creates a transition. So you can see here I'm just painting in green, and I'll add a pinch of the white to highlight it. And that's it, that's the face done. Thank you very much guys for watching the video. Can't wait to meet you in the next one. Okay, have a good one. Bye bye.